Making your way back to your ancestral home to be taxed? Following a new star? Or maybe just looking for a good time this weekend? Well, come on down to the Inn at Bethlehem, where we never run out of rooms. We've got the hottest tables, the loosest slots, and most delicious buffets in all of Judea. And so many rooms. Rooms, rooms, rooms. We've got big rooms, cozy rooms, so many rooms. We never run out of rooms. Bringing an animal with you? No problem. Leave your donkey at our world-famous Inn at Bethlehem stable. Your animal will enjoy a healthy portion of scrumptious hay in some of the fanciest mangers this side of the Galilee. And don't forget to stop by our world-famous gift shop. Not only do we have these stylish t-shirts, but we got all kinds of gifts. We got gold. We got frankincense. We even got myrrh. The perfect gift for that special someone or a baby. So while you're enjoying your time getting counted and taxed, stop by the Inn at Bethlehem, where we never run out of rooms. There's always room at the Inn at Bethlehem.
All right. Welcome, one and all, to With the Stone Rolling, featuring Dr. Jonathan England. Hey, John, how you doing?
Doing well, Tyler. How are you?
Doing better than I deserve, that's for sure. Life is
That
good.
hat looks good on you.
Thank you. Thank you. Utah State hats make everybody look good. So, well, you said the hat looked good. You didn't say much about me. Trust me, I look better with the hat. I look better with the hat.
I was just out snow blowing my driveway, so you can see I'm looking nice today.
You look fine. You look fine.
Thank you.
I was gonna
face.
A podcast, face meant for
face
podcasting,
for podcasting.
Yeah. That's great. That's great. So, well, welcome. Glad we're here. Glad we made it. And first off, I do like to start off always welcoming and being grateful for comments that we do get, comments and feedback. I want to touch on one that came in after we recorded last week, just regarding kind of how kind of our approach talking about the New Testament history, more so what was coming from documentation, what's just our opinion based on that. And so I do appreciate the comments. I think we're here to kind of share what the documentation is. It's very difficult to do that without saying how we see that world too. So but basically the question was, how much of this census stuff that you were talking about comes from that documentation that we find versus how much are you speculating on? And I think to that, well, I could tell you what I think about the documentation. I could have you, John, discuss how much of that comes from documentation versus just kind of speculation / the maybe scholarly viewpoint in the classroom.
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
Well, the way I understand it is basically Luke chapter 2 discusses a worldwide census, and that's the most contemporary and really only contemporary documentation we know about that. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay. So and anything on top of that, I guess we're kind of playing off of how either scholars would see the world around that time, and or what John and I personally think about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's just, in terms of the census, I think I mentioned this in our last episode, which was that there's evidence that a census took place in the Judea portion, I think is where it was, of Palestine, but not the Galilean portion. In other words, it would not have affected Joseph and Mary. Certainly not the entire Roman Empire. There's no Roman records of an empire-wide census that would have displaced everyone and caused them to go back to their ancestral homes. I mean, it's just a very big claim that Luke makes. And if there was some legitimacy to it, if Caesar did proclaim an empire-wide census, then there certainly would be some Roman record that happened. There just isn't, and so that's what we have to go on. That's not to say that Joseph and Mary didn't travel to Bethlehem. They certainly could have. Um, just the reasoning behind it just doesn't make sense. And so for Luke, who has, I mean, an agenda is a hard word, but he does have a box to check, right? He wants people to know Jesus's story, and to do that, he has to give that story some sort of authority. And Jewish tradition is that Jesus would be born in a certain place, and there's a box that needs to be checked there. And so, if Jesus is born in a certain place, if Luke wants him to be born in a certain place, then he needs a reason for him to be born there. And the census, it worked. It was a reason. And so, again,
Okay.
that's not to say that Joseph and Mary didn't travel to Bethlehem, that Jesus wasn't born there. It's just there's not any logical evidence to explain it other than Luke. And we do know that Luke had I guess, for lack of a better term, an agenda behind writing that passage. So
Okay.
that's where we stand. It's not, not saying it didn't happen. It's just saying that there's just not a lot of evidence to support it.
And I would add to be the other side. There's not a lot of evidence documented to disprove it, or you're just saying that that in your opinion, or maybe scholarly opinions, it doesn't it may not make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it
Gotcha.
just it doesn't
So,
hold up. Yeah.
well, I
We
do
can
very
only
much
go on
appreciate.
what we have. So
Right. Well, I do want to say I appreciate the feedback. I hope this helps be very clear as far as what documents are out there and what are we deriving from that documentation. Um, so please feel free to reach out and let us know.
yeah. And can I say
So
one more thing about that, Tyler?
I'm in charge now. Of course,
Aren't you the host?
you may proceed, John. You have my permission.
Thank you. Your graciousness. So this, though, it goes back to the way we understand history, right? And we've talked about this in the first two episodes. Our perception doesn't mesh with the perception of someone living 2,000 years ago in Palestine, right? Luke writing that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, people then would have known that census didn't happen, but they also would not have cared because they have it on authority from someone who, has authority to speak in Jesus's name, that this happened. And it's like, okay, he's telling the story for a purpose. I mean, and it's tough for us to wrap our minds around this because it just doesn't make sense. For us in our world, in our time, we need to have physical evidence. We need to have a reason that makes sense to us based on our education and our own experiences. That it wasn't like that in 2,000 years ago. History didn't work like that. So again, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it, but Luke's purpose, he's writing that not for us, he's writing it for the people who lived during his time. It doesn't, he's not concerned about what we think about it. He's concerned about what his contemporaries think about it, and they accepted it. So that's
So
the
if I
important thing.
so if I were to speak for Luke here, which I am qualified to do, mind you, as the person in charge of this podcast, um, Luke would say then that um, yes, I said this, but my point wasn't so literal. You guys get the point of what I'm
Yeah.
saying here, and 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 I said this not maybe not from a literal potentially. I mean, I may have great authority to speak, but I'm not Luke like I am Q. I'll claim that Q title still, but I'm not Luke. So he just wouldn't take it quite so literally potentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
And for, we're
I think.
talking,
Oh, I was just gonna
we're
say.
talking about like church history, and so we're, mostly from an LDS perspective. When LDS church members think of the Book of Mormon, it's very explicit that the Book of Mormon is writing for people in our time, right? There's no claim like that in the Gospels. So that makes it even harder for us, for people who are members, to wrap their minds around it, if that makes sense.
Cool. Well, let's move on then. On to our final episode, touching on the New Testament. Kind of jumping to the life of Jesus. So I think again, based along the premise we've going along these last couple of episodes, we're kind of looking from a historical perspective, the way a historian studying this in more of an academic setting sees it. So when we're talking Jesus, we're using the term, like you said, the historical Jesus. Could you remind us again what you mean by historical Jesus?
Yeah, so you typically, when we think about Jesus in the 20th century, depending on which religious tradition you're a part of, you're affiliated with, it can either be a really smart philosopher, a pacifist, the son of God, all these different things. But when we in this podcast talk about Jesus, we're talking about a person who lived 2,000 years ago. We're talking about this person before all of these different traditions and preconceived notions and not even preconceived notions, any kind of notion became attached to this figure. We're talking about a very poor individual, male from Nazareth, who had some pretty revolutionary ideas for the time. And even that statement has some uh, perception behind it, right? But we're just trying to strip away the 2,000 years of tradition and uh, and and religion that are associated with that to get to the person, the man whose name was Jesus. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe worth saying, and this is me trying to say it again in my words, we're looking at it maybe the way that somebody in the time might have seen him as a man who didn't believe his doctrine, possibly.
Yeah,
Is that fair? Okay,
yeah, that's a helpful way to think about it, I think.
great.
Okay, so yeah, let's jump into it. I think last week we talked a little bit about Nazareth and what that world was like. We know that the New Testament refers to Jesus as a carpenter, and the word for that is tacton, which means woodworker or builder. So Jesus would have been some sort of craftsman, an artisan, and being of that profession, he would have been in the lowest class of peasants, very, very poor. There's not a lot of lumber around Nazareth, so there's not much for a carpenter to be doing in that area. Um, he would have probably traveled around to neighboring cities that were bigger and done work there. And that would have exposed him to all kinds of different ideas. He would have seen other people that would be protesting Roman rule or the the priestly class of Palestine, of the temple. He would have also been exposed to very devout Jewish people. He may have been exposed to the Torah. He may have picked up reading along the way. Because, like we said in our last episode, 97% of Palestine was illiterate. More people could read than they could write, but those were very few people. And again, in the New Testament, it's pretty clear. It says that Jesus could read, and that was shocking to the people who heard him speak. They were shocked that he was so educated and that he could speak so eloquently. So this is where he could have picked some of that stuff up, is traveling around to these bigger cities and listening to people talk and picking things up along the way. Okay, and then so moving on into that, because he was a well-versed person, possibly able to read, maybe even write, that gave him some authority in the community. When people, there's kind of this Jewish tradition that goes a long way back that you only follow someone if they're educated or if they have some kind of authority that comes from education. And so Jesus, there's a good chance that Jesus had that. Otherwise, he probably would not have had such a strong and fervent following. He's referred to as a rabbi frequently throughout the New Testament. And rabbi back then didn't necessarily mean what it means now, right? The term changes over time, just like everything. But back then, it would have been considered more as a rabbi would have been considered more as a teacher. And that's what Jesus was. He begins traveling around the Galilean area, teaching and developing a following.
Are we talking the time? I'm trying to think here. So Jesus was born. He grew, and the verse grew in stature and wisdom. I don't know the exact term. And then we don't hear about him for several decades. Are you talking during those decades, or is this when he begins his ministry?
During those decades. And yeah, Tyler, if you're going to claim to be Q, I mean, you should probably know the verse a little bit better.
I'm just asking for a friend.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, everybody, well, hopefully everyone who's listening knows that there's not a lot of information between Jesus's birth and when his ministry starts. I mean, there's that passage where he's 12 years old and he's teaching in the temple. Other than that, we just don't have very much. It's that verse that you mentioned. He grew in wisdom and stature. A few other things. He spoke Aramaic. That was the language of the area of the time. We know from the New Testament that he had 4 brothers named James, Simon, Joseph, and Judas. James is actually mentioned in Josephus. We'll talk about him a little bit more later on, but he also had some sisters as well. Now, the interesting thing, though, in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, this goes back to, sorry, I should have had it ready. I don't have it memorized either. But this goes back to what we were talking about before, when everyone is kind of shocked that Jesus is so well-spoken. He's teaching and people say, isn't this Mary's son? Where did he learn all this? I'm just pulling it up right now.
I was going to say, being cute, I mixed up wisdom and stature, but I got the 2 words right. After 2,000 years, you won't even give me that?
Well, I just got it wrong. I said it was in the book of Luke. It's actually in the book of Mark. Okay, Mark chapter 6, verse 3. People respond to Jesus' teaching, and they say, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, and of Judah and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us? And they were offended at him. They're just so shocked that this carpenter knows so much. But it's interesting, is as you probably know, Tyler, or at least can assume, that in this culture 2,000 years ago, Palestinian culture, Jewish culture, was very male dominated. But this scripture doesn't mention Joseph, Mary's husband, just that he's the son of Mary. So there's something interesting there. Maybe they didn't know who Joseph was. Maybe Joseph was dead. Maybe this is a choice that Mark makes to emphasize that Jesus was, the son of God and the son of Mary, not the son of Joseph. So there's something interesting there contextually. Yeah. So anyway, that's sort of the background that Jesus would have come from. Probably literate, which would have been shocking. He comes from a poor family, probably traveled around the Galilean area quite a bit, and he spoke Aramaic.
Cool. I'm a little surprised that you told me I would presume that that area would be such a male-dominated society without asking me the question, waiting for me to respond incorrectly, and then telling me the way it is, as we've been doing so often. So, either you're going soft on me, or I caught you on a bad night.
I just want to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
You're much kinder than any of my siblings.
That's sad.
So, getting into his kind of ministry, then, Jesus. I mean, I think one of the most convincing aspects of Jesus as the great deity that he is are the miracles that he's able to perform. It's all throughout the New Testament, all throughout the Gospels. So how would one in that time kind of perceive these miracles that Jesus is walking around doing, seemingly day in, day out?
Yeah, so that's a great question that a lot of historians try to grapple with, and I would say it's kind of a useless exercise. But yeah, so one of the principal differences between an historian of Jesus and a believer in Christ is the acceptance of miracles. From a historical perspective, accepting Jesus's miracles at face value just doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's difficult to accept the supernatural, right? And there's no proof really other than what's written in the Gospels. But on the other hand, it doesn't work to explain them away either. That's kind of a futile exercise. You could say, oh, well, it's more likely that he saved Peter's mother-in-law than it is that he walked on water. That just doesn't really work. And it's kind of a dumb and I would say pointless idea to try to explain them.
From an academic perspective, right, to try to explain this is maybe how he did it, without the power of God, sort of thing.
Yeah,
because obviously you're not gonna. Academics is all about evidence, right? Evidence-based, and the whole, as I understand it, there's not a whole lot of scientific evidence designed to explain how miracles occur. That's why it's a miracle.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can take a different tact for a different approach, which is that for the historian, what matters is how people perceive them at the time. And this being a church history, LDS church history podcast, we're going to come back to this several times, but that's what's most important, is how people perceived these miracles, not so much how
they would have been explained through the centuries, right? So, what's interesting about this time, if we dive into that, how did people react to this? Well, there was never really any debate between Jesus, his believers, his followers, and his detractors about his miracles. It was just kind of accepted universally that he was a miracle worker and an exorcist. Right? I can't think of any time in the New Testament when his enemies deny his miracles. And even into the third century, anti Christians never dispute his role as a miracle worker. They probably believed that he did work miracles, and that would explain why he had so many followers. But it goes the other way too. If you think about the story of Moses, right, when he shows up in Pharaoh's court, he performs all these miracles. He throws his staff down, it turns into a snake. And what do Pharaoh's priests do? Do you remember, Tyler?
You're quizzing me again. If I do, because I watched cartoons as a kid. They did the same thing, right?
Yeah, they did. They made snakes out of whatever they had. Um, so so it's an interesting dichotomy here. You have miracles from God, but you also have miracles from uh, the other side, the enemy side, and it's interesting how people would perceive that or define that. For most people, if it happens for your side, if I'm a Hebrew and I see Moses throw his staff down and it turns into a snake, like, oh, a miracle. If I'm that same Hebrew and I see Pharaoh's priests throw their staff down and it turns into a snake, I'm like, oh, that's magic. And magic is a much more problematic term than miracle. A miracle is something positive. Um, Magic is something that just can't be explained and could be devious. So
Does magic have at times I think of magic having almost a satanic element to it. Is that part of magic back then?
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And and I think that's what a lot of Jesus's detractors probably defined it as, and I think they do actually in the New Testament. They say he's like a servant of Beelzebub, right? And that probably continued into the third century until Christianity became the dominant religion of the Western world. So absolutely, Jesus's detractors would have said this is magic and it's of the devil, not of God. And then you have on the other hand, you have people saying no, it's of God. But the point is that nobody denies that Jesus was a miracle worker or that he was involved in the supernatural. And I think that's super interesting. It gives us a very uh, informative look at the world in which Jesus lived. That people were just this accepting of the supernatural. They didn't try to explain it away or try to rationalize it like we do today. They just accepted it.
I'd like to think, well, who cares what I think? I'd like to think we know a little bit more today than they would have known 2,000 years ago, just about how things work. I mean,
Yeah.
But I understand that to them, I mean, at that point, isn't almost everything natural have some sort of, I don't want to say magical, as we defined it as as evil, but some sort of supernatural governing thing, really a god that's controlling the rain, the sun, the moon, the planets, everything. Is that how they understood it back then as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's definitely, you try to explain everything, um, and for them, they had that explanation, right? There were supernatural forces at work, and it wasn't until centuries later that people began to question that, like, what is supernatural really? And you get that delineation between supernatural and natural. But
I'm
but
on I'm on the team that string theory is still supernatural. I
string
don't get
theory.
Don't
Yeah.
understand how it works, but it's got to be.
Yeah. So anyway, back to the topic at hand.
Our next, just to throw it out there, our next podcast is going to be more physics and STEAM related, and I'll be the expert, and you can ask me all these tough questions. How does that sound?
Related. Yeah. Yeah, we could do that.
Perfect.
Um,
Let's hurry through all these episodes then, because I'm ready.
okay, so Jesus, again, nobody really questioned that he worked with the supernatural, but he wasn't the only one either. There's tons of examples of other miracle workers at the time. There's one guy named Honi, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, but he was known for drawing a circle, and he stood in this circle and he prayed for rain, prayed to God for rain, and the rain came immediately. And there's dozens of other examples. Miracle workers and exorcists were pretty common around Judea. But there's a few unique things about what Jesus did. First of all, he did it for free. He didn't charge anybody. Now, if you remember back to, I think it was our first episode, temple priests, it was their job to pray for forgiveness for the people, right? They were sort of the intercessors, or I don't know what the word is, for people who would come to the temple. These people would come to the temple, they'd pay their dues, they'd give the sacrifice, the priest would perform the sacrifice, and then offer up a prayer so that these people's sins could be forgiven or whatever blessings they need could be received. Just like Tyler's Priestcraft Barbecue, backyard Priestcraft Barbecue.
I never said I was going to charge anything for that.
Well, you were eating the meat though.
Only prime, USDA prime, top of the line.
Yeah. So you're getting paid in meat.
Didn't they feed? Never mind. Take no purse or script. Someone's got to give them food, right?
Anyway, yeah, so the temple priests are very rich because they're essentially taking money and food in exchange for blessings. So Jesus comes along and he starts healing people for free. Now, this was not only unique because, oh, there's this guy healing people. That's unique in and of itself. And he's not charging them, again, unique, but this was also a political statement. Now, so say, for example, you're a leper, okay? Lepers are all over the New Testament. They're unclean. They're considered unclean. They can't go into the temple, okay? The priests want to keep those types of people out. Menstruating women who have just given birth, they're kept out of the temple. They're considered unclean. Then Jesus comes along and he cures these people. He gets rid of the leprosy. He cures the woman with the issue with her blood. And all of a sudden, there's no excuse to keep them out of the temple. These people can go in. But also he's giving them the blessings that they would have otherwise received from the temple, forgiveness of their sins, healing, whatever else. And so this is a direct affront to the Sanhedrin, the temple priests. Like, there's this guy doing our job and he's not charging anything. He's putting us out of business. He's taking away our authority. That's the one thing that the Sanhedrin could hold over the people of Judea, is that you can't enjoy the blessings of God without us. And now there's this guy who's doing it for them for free. Second, most people, when they performed miracles at the time, had a specific way of doing it. Like that guy Honi that I just mentioned, he would draw a circle, right? Jesus didn't seem to have any method. He could just do it. One day he's spitting in someone's eyes. The next day someone just touches him and they're healed. Right? And then third, his miracles weren't an end in and of themselves. They're meant to convey a message. And Tyler, if you could do me a favor, Sunday school favor, can you pull up Matthew chapter 11?
King James or another one?
What?
King James version or anything else I can find?
Oh,
no,
yeah, whatever you have. It doesn't matter.
I just Googled it and it gave me King James, so we'll go with that.
Perfect.
Verses 1 through 6.
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Chapter 11, verses 1 through 6.
King James Version, Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. And it came to pass, when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed thence to teach and to preach in their cities. And now, when John had heard in the prison the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples, and said unto him, Art thou he that should come, or do we look for another? Jesus answered and said unto them, Go and shew John again those things which ye do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me.
Good job. That went really well. So what's happening here? John the Baptist's followers ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah?" And Jesus quotes from Isaiah, or references Isaiah 35, 5 through 6, which says that all the things that he just said. I should pull it up here. This is Isaiah 35, 5 and 6. The eyes of the blind shall be opened, ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. And it goes on. And the previous verse, God will come with vengeance. So he's basically saying all these things that you're seeing have been prophesied before. So you can take from that what you will. It's sort of like, it's not a super, specific claim to be the Messiah, but he's implying something. It's a very strong implication there that he is the Messiah, that he's the one that people have been waiting for. And again, this goes back to, this is another protest against the temple priests. The priests, again, they're the ones that control the temple, all aspects of the temple. And now this guy's coming in, he's healing them. And now he's also claiming to be the Messiah. He's welcoming all these people into his supposed kingdom, all the people that we would have shunned. So all of these things that he's doing, the miracles, are very interesting because of the supernatural component, but also because of the political and religious component to him. Maybe not religious, but mostly political, in that he's saying, look, you don't need the temple priests because I'm here and I can fill your needs. And, this has been prophesied before. He's giving himself some scriptural authority there.
And they would have he told them exactly where he got it from, it sounded like. So they would have been familiar with what he was saying and everything.
Yeah, they would have been.
You mentioned, and maybe we can keep this brief, but you mentioned in his kingdom, and earlier you mentioned he had a large following. Would this be, I think I asked previously, the organization that exists in the primitive church, would he consider this an organization, or would he just consider it, hey, I'm a Messiah, or rabbi, or teacher, or now he's obviously claiming to be bringing the kingdom of God being the, I think as someone put it, the Messiah with a big M. Would there be an organization tied to this, or just him and his followers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look at you coming in with the good questions this week.
Almost like you wrote them yourself.
That is a good question though, and there's debate around that. Like, is Jesus forming a church with this, right? And he does frequently refer to his movement as a church. Upon this rock I will build my church, that sort of thing.
Okay, yeah.
From a scholarly perspective, Jesus is starting a movement by building a community. This was one of the unique things about him. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, is the distinction, and I'm trying to think how I would distinguish a church versus a community, and not being a scholar, I don't know the clear definitions there, but to me, I think a church, it doesn't matter the person who holds a position. You have positions and people fill those positions to create the organization, and whoever's filling that position is kind of expendable. Whereas a community, they're following Jesus, and it's all about Jesus. And so without Jesus, the community would fall apart. A church, however, could continue on just by filling someone else into that role. Is that a fair distinction? Or
I think it's a mix of both of those things.
Okay.
Especially in Jesus's time. Nowadays, like your definition of a church fits perfectly. 2,000 years ago, I don't think there was a concept of a church. You know what I mean? Like, the Jews weren't part of a church. They were just Jews. That's them. That's their culture. That's their community. Jesus is not, from a scholarly point of view, an academic point of view, he's not trying to break away from Judaism per se. He's trying to bring about some of the things that it preaches, and he's trying to build a kingdom within that, within that Jewish framework. There's a lot of scriptures where he says, we're not going to non-Jews right now. We're not going to spread out. And some people, there's scriptures where he talks about who is your neighbor. Well, your neighbor, and then he tells the story of the Good Samaritan as a definition of who your neighbor is. But the idea of that is that people within Israel, those are your neighbor.
Okay.
Again, this is the scholarly perspective.
So he's creating his kingdom there. And what role would he place himself in within this kingdom? What would he refer to himself as?
So Jesus never outright calls himself God. I think he calls himself the Son of God in the Gospel of John, which is, from an academic point of view, the most problematic of the Gospels, because it comes last and it doesn't build off of Mark or Q. So Jesus considers him. So the question is, how does Jesus see himself? One thing he refers to himself as frequently throughout the New Testament is the Son of Man. Right? And when people refer to him as the Messiah, he either kind of brushes it off, tells people not to tell people that, or he accepts it with this caveat that he's the Son of Man. And this idea of the Son of Man, most scholars think that he pulled that from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, chapter 7, one of the early verses in there. It says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. So this Son of Man character in the book of Daniel was essentially the ruler in God's name. He rules the earth in the name of God. And in Mark chapter 14, 62, when he's on trial, the high priest asks him, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus says, "Yes," but he gives him his own definition of what the Messiah is, which is the Son of Man figure from Daniel. So Jesus is he's creating this community or a
Can I
kingdom.
ask,
You have a question?
Son of Man,
Yeah.
is this just saying he's not God, or is it saying he's what does, you might have just said this while I was but what does Son of Man mean?
Yeah. So the Son of Man in the book of Daniel is someone who rules the world in the name of God.
Okay.
It's not necessarily the Son of God or God himself. He's someone who rules in God's name. That's the context that Daniel rolls out in this vision that he has. So Jesus is creating a community, which he would have called a kingdom, and he is the ruler in the name of God. It's the kingdom of God, but he is the ruler, and his perception of this kingdom is a lot different than the Roman perception or the temple priest perception. His idea of the kingdom of God is a whole new social order which flips everything on its head. So you'll remember, we just talked about this. Jesus comes from a very poor background. He's the lowest of the low. He would have been around poverty. And we've also talked about how the wealth gap in Palestine is widening during this time because of the Roman taxes. So as the Romans are putting taxes on the Judeans, the Hebrews, Israelites, they have to pay that. They become more poor, but the ruling class, the Herods and the temple priests, are just raking it in because they're friendly with the Romans. Taxes kind of go through them, and so this wealth gap is widening. Jesus sees it, and this is why you get teachings like "Blessed are the poor." It is impossible or very hard for the rich to get into heaven. And by the way, that story about easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle, I know there's lots of different perceptions or ways to interpret that, different interpretations, but really it's pretty literal. He's not talking about a secret passage that camels had to go through to get into the city. He's talking about a literal needle. And this is why he was able to attract so many followers and why the temple priests were very upset with him. He's throwing their whole society into disarray. There's this guy who's healing people for free, and now he's claiming that rich people can't get into heaven. He's turning us into sinners. He's turning our benefactors, the Romans, into sinners. We can't have this. And so there's a lot of symbolism here when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. He's not on some big horse or in a fancy chariot. He rides in on a donkey. He's a peasant king, and he talks about serving others. He washes the feet of his apostles. A king wouldn't do that. A king would want his apostles to, clean his feet. And so he's flipping everything around, and the Sanhedrin don't know what to do with it. And for the Romans, this is straight up sedition. He's committing treason.
You're starting to use some words that I don't think I learned. You must be getting excited. Sedition?
Oh, yeah. All right.
Never mind. I'll Google it later.
Everything.
I'll Google it later. So I'm
inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarch. Does that work?
Yes, thank you. So I'm kind of putting a real life. I forget now. I already forgot the term that you used. The historical Jesus, meaning I'm putting a normal person in these shoes, and I could see kind of why he would avoid preaching, "Yes, I'm the Messiah," when there's a law out there that the Messiah is going to be killed. But he's now starting to gain kind of followers. He's gaining followers. He's performing miracles. Leads us to the next chapter where he has his trials. He's convicted as somewhat, and by an impartial jury, I'm sure, and then obviously he's crucified. So, what does the context around this tell us about the bigger story here?
Quite a bit, actually. So, like we just talked about, we know that Jesus had preached about a new kingdom. He caused a big to-do at the temple. You'll remember that the temple is the financial center of Palestine. It's not just the religious center. And so when he goes in and tells people to stop selling things at the temple, that's like going into Wall Street and, breaking computers on the trading floor. You just don't do that. You're throwing the whole economy into disarray. And that's what he was doing. So the Sanhedrin, when the Sanhedrin questioned him about destroying the temple, and he doesn't respond, because, he does claim this temple will be destroyed. And then at his trial, again, like you said, kind of a weird way to put it, but at this trial, they said, did you say that the temple is going to be destroyed? And he doesn't answer. That's a big deal. Again, the temple is the cultural and financial center of the entire Palestinian world, and to both the Romans and the Sanhedrin. Secondly, we know a little bit about what kind of trial Jesus would have been put through. There's a Jewish text called the Mishnah. This was the first major written collection of Jewish oral traditions, and it says quite a bit about these kinds of trials and how they should take place. And it's an interesting event because the Gospels say this trial took place during the Passover, the night before the Sabbath. Well, the Mishnah is very clear that you do not meet during the Passover, you do not meet at night, and you do not meet on the eve of the Sabbath. So there's some problems there. Secondly, in these types of trials, the accused is supposed to always be presumed innocent. In fact, before witnesses can even be called, you're supposed to give a list of why the accused is innocent. Thirdly, if the trial took place the way the Gospels claim it did, then we know what the punishment would be. Jews wouldn't turn Jesus over to the Romans for blasphemy, which is what they accused him of, right? Destroying the temple would have been considered blasphemy. They would have stoned him on the spot. And again, that's in the Mishnah. And we also see it in the book of Acts. When Stephen is accused of blasphemy, the crowd doesn't take him to Pilate or some other Roman authority. They do it right there. The stones just start flying, So something else is afoot here, and it's Jesus. The fact that Jesus is not stoned by the Jews for blasphemy, he's crucified by the Romans for sedition. Do you need that definition again, Tyler?
Yes, please.
Conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarch.
I've been accused of that a few times.
Oh, yeah. I saw you at the January 6th riot.
Oh, boy.
I'm kidding.
That Captain Baroni costume did not hide me well enough.
I'm kidding.
Red-handed.
So, all right. So the Mishnah is the argument against this. It's like, well, who cares? The Mishnah maybe says that, but the Mishnah was written in the 3rd century. That's the argument against this, right? But the Mishnah is based on oral traditions that started popping up in the 1st century. So when Mark and Luke are writing about these things, they would have been aware of what the Mishnah says. They certainly existed during the oral traditions in the Mishnah certainly existed when the Gospels were being written down. So anyway, we have that trial, and the account that we have of it is problematic because the Mishnah, this Jewish text, contradicts just about everything about it. So then we move into the next part about that, which is the trial before Pilate. Now, in the Gospels, Pilate does everything he can to save Jesus. He tries to release him. The priests won't let him. Again, there's some issues here. Pilate is a very high authority in the Roman government. The only reason a poor Jewish man would be given an audience before Pilate or being brought before him is if that person is upsetting the social order. So Pilate's not going to talk to any old rabble rouser, So there's context around this, which is that Pilate was a pretty laid back ruler, not in the sense that he just let people do whatever they wanted, but in the sense that he didn't go out of his way to make accommodations. You know what I mean? He didn't like having trials. He didn't like going to them. He governed Palestine for 10 years, and he ordered thousands of people to be crucified. He never put them to trial. He would just sign the order. And in fact, there's a source that shows that a formal complaint was filed against Pilate in Rome, and he was deposed as governor for executing too many people. So the fact that Pilate executes Jesus is not that unique. The fact that Jesus would have been brought before him is very unique. So there's two possibilities. Either this trial didn't happen, or Jesus posed a major threat to the social order in Palestine. And there's some reason to suspect that it's the former, that it didn't happen. In Mark, he talks about a custom that during Passover, Pilate would release one prisoner. He would release anyone that they asked. And Pilate offers before the Jews Jesus and Barabbas. And the Jews ask for Barabbas, the murderer. So first of all, there is no custom. There's no evidence that there was a Passover custom of Pilate releasing, or any Roman governor releasing, a Jewish prisoner. And second, Pilate really did not like Jewish customs. He was famous for disregarding their traditions. He was fine to let them worship the way they wanted as long as they kept everything in order, but he wouldn't take part in them himself. At one point, he let his troops carry banners into the city bearing the image of Caesar. And this would have been against Jewish law because it's considered a graven image. He also used the funds from the temple to build an aqueduct to Jerusalem. And when the people protested, he had them beaten to death. So he was pretty flippant about Jewish traditions and customs. There's not a lot of contextual evidence that supports what the Gospels say about Pilate's actions.
Gotcha. I'm going to interrupt this great discussion. Podcasts are called podcasts because you can break any rule you want. And typically I have a hard stop at an hour. I'm going to break that rule if that's okay with you, John. We just have a little bit more to get through, and I want to get, I think it would make sense to finish up Jesus and then get into more the restoration stuff. So if you need to drop off, this is your one chance to do it without me calling you up and asking what's wrong. No. All right. So, sorry. I just wanted to throw that in there. I know I hate when people are looking at their watches like, he should be done by now. Podcasts are great.
Right. Talk too much.
No. I would rather go along than have you not say any of this. So this is great. So you're mentioning then how brutal Pilate was, how all that, and how there's some, maybe, I don't want to use the word problematic, but potentially inconsistencies between how the Gospels were written based on the trial and crucifixion versus how history shows that they typically did things like that. Why would you think that the Gospel writers would tell the story this way if it wasn't the way it happened?
Yeah, that's the big question. And it goes back to, again, how people 2,000 years ago interpreted history. We've covered that, so I won't go into it again. But there's also a liturgical purpose to that. Let me define that word for you.
Thank you. I haven't looked at it, and there's no way I could have guessed.
Okay, liturgy. Liturgical comes from the word liturgy. Liturgy is a form or formulary according to which public religious worship, especially Christian worship, is conducted. So it's essentially public worship, public ritual.
Very well done.
Thank you.
The more I talk with you, the more convinced a PhD is just a big literacy test. You need to know words, maybe even a spelling bee. I don't know if you need to know how to spell them. Is that all? Because the lexicon you all use is quite impressive.
Lexicon. Wow.
I had a
Good for
teacher
you,
in junior high
Tyler.
who taught me that. Yeah, and I remembered it. I use it about once every decade. This is my 2020s
No,
decade use of that word.
You don't need to know how to spell things. You just have to have a good spell checker, and Microsoft Word is really good at it. So, but yeah, words I guess help. But so telling the story this way helps to ritualize the last days of Jesus.
I've already forgotten what liturgy means. Sorry. I was so impressed with my use of lexicon. I just completely forgot where we were going in the discussion.
We'll just plow through it. Public worship.
All right. Public worship. Okay. Good enough.
Yeah.
Go
So he does it. It's told this way for the benefit of public ritual and worship. By telling the story this way, early Christians had a way to relive the last days of Jesus through ritual. It gives them a way to worship, essentially. We have Easter week, or Easter week, I guess. And it also, just like Jesus's birth, it checks all the boxes that needed to be checked in order for Jesus to be considered the Messiah and then the Christ. And so, again, the Messiah is a Jewish savior who comes to free the Jewish people from captivity. The Christ is a Greek word, means the anointed one. That has more of a spiritual connotation, that Christ is someone who will free followers from sin and bring them to heaven, to put it simply. So that's one reason that his story is told that way. Second reason is to win converts, frankly. So Mark is writing his gospel in the 70s. And in the 70s, 70 CE, you have the Jewish revolt. Jesus's life kind of leads up to that. We've talked about that. There's lots of different messiahs kind of preaching freedom from Rome. And it comes to a head in the 70s. The Jews kick the Romans out of Jerusalem. The Romans come back and just lay waste to the city. They burn everything, and including the temple. And it's pretty brutal. Now, because Rome is in control of everything, they're the victors. They tell a story. People around the Roman Empire are not very empathetic towards the Jews, because, again, Romans are telling the story like, well, we had to do what we had to do. They were breaking the law and all that kind of stuff, however you want to put it. The point is that Jews did not have a lot of friends around the Roman Empire. And these are the people that Mark is preaching to. He's not going to win. The Jews have already kind of dismissed the Christian movement. And there's a couple of reasons for that. There's evidence that Jesus's brother, James, over for him after Jesus died, and he was executed. So, and then you have Peter, who moves to Rome and becomes the church is kind of doing well in Southern Europe and not so well in Palestine. And then you have the fact that you have the Jewish revolt, which doesn't win anyone any friends. So if you were to go into Rome and say, "Hey, we have this new religion," they're going to ask, "Well, where's it based out of?" "Oh, it's based out of Jerusalem." They're going to be like, "Get out of my bathhouse," whatever. So Mark tells the story the way he does to kind of exonerate Rome from Christ's death. And he blames the Jews for it. He can't blame Romans because he wouldn't win any converts. And then you have the scripture when Pilate kind of absolves himself from Jesus's death. The Jewish leaders say, "His blood be on us and our children." And that's a scripture that has been used for centuries to kind of justify Jewish persecution. So Mark needs to distance himself and all Christians from the Jewish revolt, which ended in such a disaster.
Cool.
Do you want me to talk about the resurrection a little bit, and then we'll call it good for Jesus' life?
Let's do that. I think we're already in a depressed state right here. Let's talk about the resurrection, and hopefully that helps us feel a little better.
Yeah.
And
so,
then, yeah, go ahead.
So just a couple things on the resurrection. First of all, there's not really a strong Jewish tradition of the Messiah of being beaten and dying and then resurrecting. That kind of comes out of early Christianity. The second thing is, obviously, it's a pretty bold statement to say that this guy was killed and then came back to life. Just from a practical standpoint, right? Even people 2,000 years ago may have had a hard time accepting that. But the interesting thing about it is that all the people who claimed it never denied it either. The people who claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus went through all kinds of abuse and torture and persecutions, but they never denied it despite all those terrible things happening to them. So that's kind of interesting. But
that is interesting, and I was almost feeling better, and then you had to bring in the persecution of the witnesses just to end it on a bad note again.
Yep.
No.
Yep.
Well, this has been. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'll just give a quick epilogue. So Jesus dies.
Yeah.
The resurrection is proclaimed, and there's kind of a tension between the church in Jerusalem, which is being led by James, Jesus's brother, and the church outside of Jerusalem, which is being eventually led by Paul. And there's even passages where Paul is kind of rebuked by the church in Jerusalem. But in any case, to make a long story short, the church in Rome kind of emerges as the leading sect of Christianity, and it kind of takes off from there. So there's your epilogue. That's a whole nother podcast series, but awesome. We want to get on to other things, I think.
We're not going to be trending for another 150 years. So hopefully we get to that. But no, this is great. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk about this New Testament. I know it's not kind of the main focus of your studies and not the main focus of our podcast, but it definitely gave me a new perspective of maybe a different way, things to consider, a different way to look at it, and definitely the context around what's going on culturally and politically, and just as far as how people probably saw these writings in early Christianity. So I appreciate that. And I'm excited. I'm super excited to move on to the next phase. Let's we're ready to give these people what they paid for here. So
yeah.
should be good. Do you want to give us a little bit of a teaser where you plan on starting us next week?
Yeah. So it's kind of tough. I mean, we could go over the next 1800 years, but I think what we'll do is we'll jump into the Second Great Awakening, which by necessity would have to define the First Great Awakening, but we could do that quick. We'll talk about the Second Great Awakening because this is the time and culture that Joseph Smith comes out of. And early America, there's a lot of interesting things happening. America had just won its independence, and from that you have a lot of different religious movements. We do have a concept of religion now and of a church. And so, yeah, it'll be fun to jump into that. And especially we'll talk about how the figure Jesus went from the historical Jesus to Jesus the Christ. So that's what we'll touch on next time.
Great. I look forward to that. And just an invitation to our listeners. First off, if you haven't subscribed on YouTube, that's, like I said last episode, that's kind of where we track it. Go ahead and rate us on wherever you're listening. But if you haven't subscribed on YouTube yet, please do so. And also just an invitation, if you like the way that we are approaching this from a historic perspective, and you feel like you know somebody who could benefit from this, please share this with friends. Let them know. I don't recommend. I don't ask that you use this as a tool to, hey, I know people who left the church. Let's send them this way so they can get the information from a different perspective and reconsider coming back. Or on the other side, this history may show people the church is wrong. Don't use it for that. I'm not here for that. But if you know people who really are looking into the history, struggling to understand it, trying to figure out what sources can they trust, can they not trust, and you think that John does a fair enough job presenting it in a more neutral approach based on the documents and such, those are the people that I invite you to share this with. And hopefully we can kind of just step through and get through the whole history of the church. Does that sound fair, John? Or
Yeah.
Do you just want them to invite everyone?
You can invite everyone, but yeah, I think we don't like to be used as ammunition, I guess. But I was thinking about this today. Who our target audiences? I think it's just people who are bored of they've heard it all before, and maybe they want something that's not produced in a way that's got a certain angle to it. Like Tyler said, we try to be neutral. I guess the academic word for that is objective. Just present the facts and the sources and the context so that you can have a richer understanding of what's going on.
All right. Well, thank you. I look forward to it.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
All right. Well, we made it to an hour 15 past my bedtime. Well done.
Thank you.
Rough. Roll on. Gotta turn on the volume. I'm also looking for producing jobs, so if anyone needs a producer of a podcast, please give me a call.